It was a cold, white morning somewhere near Remagen, 1945. Frost covered the grass like ash, and the sound of boots crunching over gravel echoed down the muddy parade ground. 50 captured German women stood in line, faces pale, jaws tight, uniforms torn and faded. Across from them, a group of U.S. medics moved with quiet precision, clipboards in hand, their breath steaming in the cold. What was about to happen wasn't torture, wasn't interrogation. It was worse in its own way. It was the stripping of pride by protocol. No one spoke at first. The air hung heavy with humiliation and disbelief. One German woman, barely 20, whispered, "They'll strip us like animals." Another hissed, "Keep your chin up. Don't let them see you break." But the Americans weren't sneering or laughing. Their faces were neutral, professional, indifferent. That was the shock. Not hatred, not vengeance, just cold efficiency. A sergeant shouted, "Medical inspection line, move forward." His voice carried no cruelty, just command. One by one, the women stepped forward, unbuttoning their coats under the dim morning light. Each movement felt heavier than the last. The German nurse turned. Soldier at the front flinched when the American officer's gloved hand stopped her. He wasn't leering, he was writing, measuring, recording bruises, malnutrition, lice. She realized with dread that she was being treated like data, not a person. Reports indicate that by the end of the war, more than 3,500 German women were captured in the Western theater. Most were nurses, clerks, or auxiliaries. They weren't soldiers, yet here they stood, subjected to the same sterile process as any POW. The inspection had one goal: prevent disease outbreaks. But for the prisoners, it felt like a dismantling of their dignity, bit by bit, under watchful American eyes. One woman later wrote in her diary, "They looked at us like machines, no hatred, no desire, just procedure." That sentence would haunt her for decades. Because what she witnessed that morning wasn't American cruelty. It was something colder, a mechanical morality. As the last woman in the row stepped forward, an officer lifted a clipboard, tapping his pen against the metal edge. The sound cut through the frost, bitten air like a blade. He adjusted his glasses, expression unreadable. And when he looked up, what he saw next would decide the tone of the entire inspection. The clipboard came down with a faint thud against the officer's chest. His expression stayed fixed, impersonal, methodical. "Begin section 2, he murmured to the nurse beside him. A pencil scratched against the paper. The inspection had officially begun. Steam rose from the women's mouths as they breathed through clenched teeth. Boots shuffled in the gravel. Somewhere behind them, a generator hummed and the smell of diesel mixed with soap powder. The first woman stepped forward. The officer didn't meet her eyes. His gloved hand pointed at the medic. "Check for lice, record bruising, malnutrition level 3. His tone was the same as someone reading inventory off a supply list. The nurse's hands trembled slightly as she noted everything. The woman's ribs showed through her skin, her collarbones sharp as wire. She had the look of starvation common in the last months of the Reich, sunken cheeks, hollow gaze. According to U.S. military medical logs, nearly 40% of German women POW arriving in 1945 showed visible signs of deficiency or disease. Many hadn't seen proper food or soap in weeks. But statistics couldn't capture the tension in that tent, the war reduced to a checklist of scars, boils, and infections. Each inspection was a small humiliation measured in seconds. A German POW whispered under her breath, "At least the Soviets would have shot us." Another muttered, "No, this is slower." Yet when the officer noticed her shaking hands, he didn't shout or punish. Instead, he paused. His eyes flicked to her dog tag, then back to the chart. "She's stable," he said quietly, "move her along." That neutrality cut deeper than cruelty. To the captured women, it felt like being erased. The Americans weren't looking for beauty, guilt, or innocence, only disease. Every touch was clinical, every gesture calculated. It wasn't lust or hate, it was bureaucracy with a heartbeat. Later, one POW would write it wasn't cruelty. It was humiliation by indifference. That line would echo through the barracks for months. As the officer moved down the line, clipboard smudged with pencil marks and fingerprints, his assistant hesitated. A flicker of unease crossed her face. She was young, maybe 21, a U.S. Army nurse who'd seen too much too fast. And in that moment she made a choice that broke the rhythm of the inspection entirely. The tense canvas rippled with wind, snapping like a flag over unease. Inside, the inspection line had stopped. The young American nurse, her hair tucked under a loose cap, eyes rimmed with fatigue, stood frozen. The next German woman waited in front of her, half-buttoned, shivering not from cold but from exposure. The officer glanced up, irritation flickering behind his glasses. "Continue, Lieutenant," he said sharply. But she didn't move. Her gloved hands trembled. She'd followed orders from Normandy to the Rhineland, dressing wounds, amputating limbs, disinfecting wounds that smelled of death. But now, staring at this thin German girl, barely older than herself, the nurse's breath caught. "Sir, this isn't right," she whispered. The officer's jaw tightened. "We have to check for lice and disease. Rules are rules." His pencil scratched again, trying to erase emotion with procedure. But something in the nurse's tone cracked the rhythm. The line of POWs stiffened, watching this small rebellion in silence. According to Geneva Convention guidelines of 1929, female prisoners were to be examined only by women, with dignity preserved. But field conditions often blurred those lines. Reports later showed that many American medics, overwhelmed by thousands of POW, followed stripped-down procedures literally and figuratively. The nurse's refusal sparked whispers among the Germans. One murmured, "She turned her eyes away, that's the first mercy we've seen." It wasn't sympathy that moved them, it was the recognition that someone, even from the enemy, felt the weight of their shame. The officer sighed. "Fine, move on, visual check only." He rubbed his forehead, exhaustion heavier than authority. The inspection resumed, but slower, quieter. The pencil marks no longer sounded mechanical. They hesitated between lines. Later, one diary entry from a captured German auxiliary would read, "She turned her eyes away. That's when I realized. This was not revenge." For the first time since their capture, the women saw an American flinch, not from danger, but from conscience. Outside, rain began to patter against the tent roof, washing away footprints in the mud. Inside, the silence deepened, thicker than before. The nurse stepped back, folding her arms, refusing to look up again. The officer's face hardened. He knew he couldn't let that hesitation spread through his team. And so, within minutes, the argument began. The rain outside had grown heavier, drumming on the tent's roof like artillery far away. Inside, the air was thick with sweat and authority. The inspection line had frozen again half. Dressed POW waiting, guards exchanging uneasy glances. The American officer slammed his clipboard onto the field table. "Lieutenant, we can't afford sentimentality," he snapped. "These inspections keep typhus out of the camps." The nurse stood her ground, rainwater dripping from her cap brim. "With respect, sir, this isn't an inspection anymore. It's humiliation. They're terrified." A medic nearby looked up from his notes. "She's not wrong," he muttered. The officer's glare cut through him, but the silence had already shifted. For the first time, the men hesitated, not from insubordination, but from doubt. According to Red Cross records, during the spring of 1945, American medical teams processed up to 200 prisoners per hour during large-scale surrenders. Efficiency mattered more than emotion. Yet here, inside one tent in Germany, that rhythm had finally cracked. The officer paced, boots grinding in mud. "You think they didn't humiliate our nurses in France? You think they'd hesitate?" His words hit hard, but lacked conviction. The nurse looked at the German women, silent, dripping, staring straight ahead, and whispered, "Maybe that's why we should." The tent went still. For a brief second, only the sound of rain filled the space. A young private coughed. The officer exhaled through his nose, shoulders sagging. Fine, he said finally, voice tired, minimal contact, visual checks only, note what you can see, move the line. The Germans didn't smile, didn't thank her. But the air shifted, a strange calm tinged with disbelief. One woman wrote later they fought among themselves for us. That thought unsettled her more than any touch could have. The revised orders spread quickly, visual inspection only, no unnecessary contact. It made the process slower but cleaner. More humane, if that word even fit in war. As the tent lights flickered, the nurse took a step back, breathing hard. She knew she'd won something small, but real. The officer picked up his clipboard again, his hand trembling ever so slightly as he flipped to a new page. "Resume," he said quietly. "Let's finish this." Outside, the guards shouted new instructions. The next phase was about to begin. Different orders, same unease. The rain eased by morning, leaving the camp slick with mud and silence. The new orders had spread, visual checks only, no touching unless absolutely necessary. It sounded humane on paper, but in practice it only sharpened the edge of humiliation. The women stood again under harsh floodlights, stripped to their undershirts, every flaw and scar illuminated. The Americans kept their distance now, eyes sweeping, pens scratching, expressions blank. The inspection line moved faster. One officer timed them with a wristwatch, calling out, "Next, next, next." The rhythm turned mechanical, almost industrial. But something in those repeated glances felt colder than contact ever did. The POW weren't being touched, but they were being seen in a way that pierced deeper. A captured German nurse whispered to the woman beside her, "They don't even see us. Just bodies to check off." The irony wasn't lost on her back home. She'd done the same to wounded soldiers without looking twice. Now she was the subject of the same detached mercy. According to medical reports after the procedural shift, infection cases dropped by 18%. Statistically, it worked. Humanly, it hollowed them out. The American officers marked fevers, bruises, rashes, all from a distance. A clipboard replaced contact. Compassion became paperwork. The same young nurse who had refused the strip search earlier now stood to the side, eyes lowered, silent. She followed orders, but her posture betrayed exhaustion. Her moral victory had turned into quiet guilt. Her choice had made things cleaner, but not kinder. One German POW would later recall, "They touched us less, but the gaze burned deeper." That gaze, dispassionate, assessing, made every woman feel dissected without a scalpel. Behind the line, one of the guards whispered to another, "You ever wonder if they think we're monsters?" The other shrugged. "Doesn't matter, orders are orders." The phrase echoed the same mechanical logic the Germans once used. The symmetry was uncomfortable, almost poetic. By noon, the last woman passed inspection. The officers signed off, the lights dimmed, and the sound of rain returned soft, forgiving, almost gentle. But inside each POW, something raw had shifted. They weren't just prisoners anymore. They were witnesses to how mercy could still humiliate. As they were herded back toward the barracks, no one spoke. The sound of dripping rain on tin roofs followed them into the night. Night fell hard and hollow. The women shuffled into their barracks, tin roofs rattling under the wind, a single bulb flickering over the door. Inside, the air smelled of soap, damp wool, and fear. No one spoke at first. The inspection had ended, but its shadow lingered. They washed in silence, buckets clanging, the water turning grey with mud and shame. A German auxiliary, once proud in her Luftwaffe uniform, stared at a reflection in the steel basin. Her hands shook as she scrubbed, the cold biting her knuckles raw. They saw everything. She whispered, not to anyone, just to the walls. Across from her, another woman muttered, "At least they didn't hit us." It was meant as comfort, but it sounded more like surrender. The barracks were simple: plywood bunks, army blankets, soap bars stamped U.S. Army. Outside, guards patrolled quietly, the rhythm of boots steady, distant. Inside, the prisoners' whispers turned from humiliation to disbelief. They couldn't reconcile what had happened. The Americans had inspected them, shamed them, but then given them food. Real food. Bread still soft, canned beans, even coffee, according to U.S. Camp supply logs. Each prisoner received roughly 200 calories per day, better than the average German civilian ration in 1945. Some camps even issued vitamins and soap rations from surplus Red Cross stock. The contrast hit them hard. The same hands that took their pride were now feeding them more than their own command ever had. One woman wrote in a notebook that night, "They fed us better than our own army did." It wasn't gratitude, it was confusion. Her entire belief system cracked under that contradiction. The younger ones tried to sleep. The older ones prayed softly, not for freedom, but for understanding. Every creak of the bunks sounded like the echo of boots outside the tent earlier that day. As the bulb flickered out, one woman whispered through the dark, "Do they hate us or pity us?" No one answered. The question hung in the stale air like a confession. In the corner, the nurse from earlier, now prisoner 114, B, closed her eyes. She wasn't angry anymore. She was curious about them, about why the enemy's mercy felt more cutting than cruelty. That curiosity would grow by morning. By dawn, the silence had cracked. Steam from the morning soup kettles mixed with chatter that hadn't existed the night before. The German women nurses, typists, auxiliaries had begun asking questions, small ones at first. What's in this bread? Why is their coffee so strong? How do they get soap that smells like fruit? It wasn't defiance, it was disbelief turned to curiosity. Outside the barracks, an American guard leaned against a fence post, cigarette dangling from his lips. A prisoner approached, hesitant but bold. "Do you trade?" she asked, pointing to the cigarette. He smirked and held up 2 fingers. 2 for 1. She handed him a pair of handmade hairpins. He passed her an aspirin packet in return. She stared at the tiny white tablets as if holding treasure. This was how it began, quiet exchanges that revealed something more dangerous than rebellion understanding. According to Red Cross records, by late 1945, the U.S. Army had distributed over 9 million hygiene kits to POW camps across Europe. Each contained soap, toothpaste, a comb, and sometimes chocolate. For women who had bathed with cold water and sand for months, it was civilization in a box. Yet that abundance didn't comfort them, it insulted them. One prisoner muttered, "They fight a war and still have time for perfume." Another whispered, "Their uniforms don't even smell of fear." It was the first time many realized the war had never been equal. The Americans had not only more weapons, but more stuff. Food, medicine, supplies, everything. Even kindness was rationed from abundance. A guard watched as the German women washed their faces using American soap, the scent of lemon cutting through the stale air. He said quietly to his buddy, "They think we're angels, wait till they see a factory." The other laughed. "Yeah, they'll think we built heaven." That night, the prisoners talked about America as if describing another planet. Cars for everyone, milk in bottles, soldiers who didn't starve. One POW wrote later their abundance was insulting. But that insult would soon evolve into awe, once they saw where all that came from, because outside the camp fence, trucks were arriving. Endless, rumbling, loaded with supplies that would redefine what power meant. The ground trembled before the sound arrived. A deep, rolling thunder, not from guns, but from engines, convoys, dozens of U.S. supply trucks grinding through the mud outside the camp, lined nose-teat, ale like an iron river. The German women, still clutching their soup tins, drifted toward the fence. The noise swallowed the morning. Diesel fumes filled the air. The first truck passed a GMC CCKW, its side stamped with a white star, canvas flapping in the wind. Then another, and another. Wooden crates stacked high food, fuel, medicine, uniforms, even cigarettes. The convoy seemed endless. Some women counted aloud, reaching 50 before giving up. One muttered under her breath, "That's more than our entire division ever saw." For the first time, they weren't looking at soldiers, they were looking at machines of plenty. According to Allied logistics data, one American infantry division consumed roughly 60 0 gallons of fuel per day, more than an entire German corps. Each truck carried tons of goods that could keep an army moving for weeks. Where Germany rationed soap, the U.S. shipped it by the ton. Where the Wehrmacht scraped for spare boots, the Americans burned old ones just to make space for new shipments. A POW whispered, "No wonder we lost. They had more trucks than we had tanks." Her words were half awe, half despair. From the guard tower, an American sergeant watched them watching. You can see it in their eyes. He said to a private beside him, "They're realizing it wasn't about courage, it was about factories. The convoy kept coming, field kitchens, water tankers, medical vans." The women couldn't look away. Some laughed nervously. Others cried silently. One of them, a clerk from Hamburg, pressed her hands against the fence and whispered, "We were never fighting soldiers. We were fighting production lines." That sight broke something deeper than pride. It shattered the illusion of struggle and fairness. The German women had been taught that sacrifice could win a war. Now they saw that abundance could end it. The engines faded into the distance, leaving only exhaust and silence. The camp suddenly felt smaller, the fences more real. Inside the barracks, one woman stared at her bowl of rations and said quietly, "We could never have one." That night the camp was quiet again, but it wasn't the silence of fear this time. It was the silence of realization. The women sat on their bunks, staring into tin cups of black coffee, thinking not about freedom, but about why they'd believed what they did. The trucks had done what bullets never could. They'd shown the truth. A former propaganda clerk whispered, "Everything we learned was a lie." The others didn't answer, but the shame in their eyes said enough. She'd once typed speeches about German superiority, about purity and destiny. Now she was wearing a patched-up American blanket, eating Allied bread, and surviving because of enemy medicine. A U.S. medic walked by, handing out vitamin tablets through the door. One POW looked up and murmured, "Dank." He just nodded, moving on. That brief exchange, wordless and human, cut through years of ideology like sunlight through smoke. According to post-war surveys by U.S. Army intelligence, over 70% of German POW admitted changing their political views after captivity. The numbers weren't propaganda, they were shock statistics, proof that human contact could dismantle indoctrination faster than interrogation ever did. A woman from Dresden confessed quietly, "When I saw their trucks, I realized our war was a fantasy. They lived in the future and we were dying in the past." Her friend replied, "The Führer said we were chosen, but they had trucks that never stopped. Maybe they were the chosen ones. The words weren't treason anymore. They were mourning." In her bunk, one of the nurses pulled out a torn notebook she'd kept hidden since Normandy. She wrote, "The lies we swallowed now taste like ash." Then she closed it and hid it beneath her pillow. Outside, floodlights buzzed faintly, illuminating rows of barbed wire that no longer looked like punishment, just reality. The camp wasn't hell, it was proof. From the guard post, the young American nurse from before watched them quietly. She saw their eyes not defiant now, but hollow, searching. She wondered what it felt like to lose not just a war, but a world view. And then, as she turned to leave, she saw something unexpected, a small act that would shift everything again. The morning mist hung low over the camp, curling around the fences like ghostly smoke. The German women lined up for their rations, same tin trays, same silence. But near the end of the queue, something different happened. A young American guard, barely 20, noticed one of the women lagging behind. Her uniform hung loose on her frame, her skin grey with illness. She coughed weakly and clutched her side. He glanced around, no officers in sight. From his jacket pocket, he pulled out a small, wrapped bar of soap, one from the Red Cross crate marked MedSup. Without a word, he placed it on a tray next to the bread. The woman froze, staring at the white rectangle like it was gold. He just nodded once and moved on. That was it. No speech, no gesture of pity, just soap and silence. Later, that same woman wrote, He didn't say a word, but it said everything. To the prisoners, it wasn't the soap that mattered. It was what it represented. A kindness without demand, a mercy that wasn't political. For months they'd been handled, measured, inspected, processed. Now, for one fragile second, they were seen. Reports indicate that after hygiene reforms in late 1945, disease rates in U.S. run POW camps dropped by 30%. But what numbers couldn't show was the psychological shift that followed. The women began to wash again, not because they were ordered to, but because they wanted to feel human. The smell of soap became the smell of recovery. That night, the woman who received the bar divided it into 3 slivers and shared it with her bunkmates. Each washed their hands in turn, laughing softly at the absurd luxury of cleanliness. The barracks filled with the faint scent of citrus. It was the first real laughter anyone had heard in weeks. Outside, the guard smoked his last cigarette and watched the barracks window glow faintly under the moon. He didn't know what his small act had started, but by the next morning the camp felt lighter. Inside, discipline began to return, but not the kind born of orders. The kind that comes from rebuilding dignity, one bar of soap at a time. The sound of brooms sweeping became the new morning anthem. The same women who once trembled under floodlights were now scrubbing floors, organizing supplies and humming under their breath. The barracks, once soaked in humiliation, had begun to echo with something unexpected: order, not the kind barked by sergeants, but the quiet rhythm of people rebuilding themselves. Every morning at dawn, the prisoners lined up for roll call. Then came cleaning duty, laundry, and small tasks assigned by American officers. It wasn't forced labor, it was structure. The same structure that once broke them now began to hold them up. A former secretary from Munich started teaching English using torn newspaper scraps. Another, a nurse, offered to help the camp medic disinfect the infirmary. Within a week, the women had built a fragile micro-society. The nurse wrote in her notebook, "We found discipline again, but not for war, according to U.S. camp reports. Nearly 40% of German POW volunteered for internal duties once their health stabilized. In women's camps, routines reduced anxiety and illness drastically. It was psychological triage disguised as work. The young American nurse, the same one who'd once looked away during inspection, now oversaw sanitation schedules. She watched the women move with quiet coordination, and something in her chest softened. They weren't enemy anymore. They were exhausted humans learning to exist again. One morning, she entered the barracks to find a small chorus forming. 5 women singing a hymn in broken harmony. Their voices were rough but strong, carrying over the sound of buckets and broom handles. For a moment, even the guards paused to listen. The melody wasn't German. It was borrowed from a song the Americans had been playing on a field radio days earlier. That subtle mimicry was more than cultural exchange. It was survival through adaptation. As sunlight streamed through cracks in the tin walls, the camp no longer looked like punishment. It looked like purgatory slowly turning into life. That night, the nurse closed her logbook and whispered to a medic, "They're starting to heal." He nodded. "Yeah, maybe we all are. But healing had its own dangers, because word was spreading, rumors of release, transport lists, names being called. And with hope came fear. It started as a rumor. A guard at the fence mentioned lists. Then a medic slipped up, saying transport. Within a day, the entire camp buzzed with whispers. Release, the word spread like wildfire through the barracks, soft, trembling, dangerous. Some women clutched their rosaries. Others packed what little they had. A comb, a tin spoon, a folded blanket. Freedom had once been a fantasy. Now it terrified them. One woman asked, "Where will we even go?" Her hometown in Königsberg no longer existed. Another murmured, "My parents were in Dresden," and let the sentence die. The thought of going home was no longer a dream. It was a wound reopening. The Americans noticed the shift. smiles mixed with tears, laughter turned to quiet sobs at night. The young nurse, now accustomed to routine and faces, walked through the barracks counting heads. "You'll be going home soon," she said softly. A voice from a bunk answered, "To what home?" "According to you, S." Army repatriation records, over 425,000 German POW were sent home from American camps by the end of 1946. The process was massive buses, ships, paperwork, medical screenings. But for many of these women, the idea of home had eroded. The war had burned maps and memories alike. In one corner, a woman polished her boots with the corner of a blanket, her hands steady for the first time in months. "If they see us clean," she whispered, "maybe they'll forget what we were." Another helped braid her hair. Across the room, someone hummed the same hymn from before, but slower, more fragile. The nurse watched them with mixed feelings. Part of her was relieved. It meant fewer patients, fewer nightmares, but another part ached. She had come to know their stories, their faces, their small jokes during ration line. Now she'd watch them vanish, one transport at a time. As night fell, engines rumbled faintly beyond the fence. Trucks were being prepared. The guards spoke quietly, voices heavy. The women didn't sleep. They lay awake, clutching their small belongings, staring at the ceiling. Freedom was coming, but no one knew if it was rescue or exile. Dawn came slow, pale, and silent. The trucks waited in neat rows outside the gate, canvas tops slick with dew, engines humming like a steady heartbeat. The German women stepped out one by one, each carrying a small satchel, their faces unreadable. The guards didn't bark orders anymore, they spoke quietly, almost respectfully. One by one, names were checked off the clipboard that had started it all. The young American nurse stood near the gate, holding her cap against the wind. She watched the women climb aboard, their boots slipping in the mud. For weeks she'd seen them as patients, inmates, survivors. Now they were just travelers returning to a country she couldn't imagine ever feeling like home. Each truck carried about 80 prisoners. Wooden benches lined the inside, metal rails rattling as the engines revved. The air smelled of diesel and damp wool. A few women tried to smile, waving faintly toward the camp guards. Others stared straight ahead, eyes hollow but calm. According to Army transport records, each convoy carried roughly 400 POW per trip toward the northern ports, mostly Bremen and Bremerhaven. There, ships waited to carry them back into a broken Germany. The journey could take days, sometimes weeks. Inside one truck, a woman clutched her satchel tightly, whispering a line she'd repeated since capture. "We left clean, fed, and confused." The others nodded in silence. As the convoy rolled out, dust rose behind the tires, blurring the edges of the camp. The women didn't look back. They didn't need to. Their memories were carved deep enough. The nurse raised her hand in a small salute, a gesture of respect rather than farewell. One prisoner caught her eye through the back flap of the truck and gave a faint nod. Two strangers, bound by a war neither wanted. The nurse lowered her hand, blinking against the morning glare. The trucks rumbled down the dirt road, the horizon swelling with grey clouds. Inside, the prisoners sat shoulder to shoulder. No songs, no speeches, just the low hum of engines and thoughts too heavy to speak aloud. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang over the ruins. Home was near, but peace still felt impossibly far. Years later, in a quiet cafe in Hamburg, one of those women sat across from a reporter. The war was history now, but its shadows still clung to her voice. She was 60, her hair silver, her posture straight. When the reporter asked what moment stayed with her most, not a battle, not the surrender, but that inspection, she looked down at her hands before answering. "They inspected our bodies," she said softly, and it felt like the end of dignity. She paused, tracing the rim of her teacup. But later I realized it was the start of something else. The reporter leaned forward. "What do you mean?" She smiled faintly. "We thought they meant to humiliate us, But they were just doing their duty, and in that cold duty there was no hatred. That's what disgusted us most, that they didn't care enough to hate. Her words hung between them like smoke. After the war, records showed that only about 3% of female POW ever filed formal complaints about their treatment by U.S. forces. Most described their shock not as physical harm, but as moral disorientation. They had expected cruelty and found bureaucracy instead. For many, that indifference was harder to process than pain. The woman took a slow sip of coffee, her eyes distant. "They stripped our pride, not our skin," she said, "and when I looked back, I realized that's what broke us. Not fists, not fire, procedure. Outside, traffic hummed, indifferent as ever. The city had rebuilt itself from rubble, glass towers over old foundations. But for her, the memory of those floodlights, those clipboards, those quiet American medics had never faded. I hated them for how gentle they were," she whispered finally, "because it made me see who we had become." The reporter said nothing. His recorder clicked off with a soft snap. She looked out the window, rain beginning to fall, steady and grey, just like that morning in 1945. "Maybe," she said, almost to herself, "humanity survives only when procedure feels like mercy." And as the raindrops blurred the city lights, the reflection of a white canvas tent seemed to flicker in the glass distant, ghostly, forever caught between shame and survival.